alive. I'm reading out of Return to Elysium. It is a life of Joan Grant. She passed away in 1989, and she wrote books about her far memory, her previous incarnation. This is her incarnation as Lucina in the 2nd century BC. We are already in the 3rd part of this book, and I'm on chapter 3 entitled The Sea. Euripides had gone to look for a shipmaster who would give us passage to Athens. The litter bearers had gone back to Cordelia, and I was alone on the quay, trying to shelter from the wind behind a stack of empty barrels. I saw him walking towards me across the wet cobbles, and knew by the set of his shoulders that he had failed. "I can't find any ship to take us," he said. "The shipmasters either say they are not calling at any Greek port, or else they want more than we can pay. How much money have we left?" "It ought to be enough, if they will accept our currency. If only we had someone who could sponsor us, it would be easier. They don't like taking passengers who have no responsible person to speak for them. Sailors are superstitious. They are afraid that a stranger might be an ill omen." "There must be some ship. It doesn't matter if it only carries cargo. I'm not afraid of being uncomfortable." "Don't you know anyone in Rome who could use his influence? Think hard, Lucina. Surely there is someone you could ask for help." "I've never begged, and I'm not going to start now." I knew I sounded bad-tempered, but I was cold and tired, and the prospect of being stuck here indefinitely was most disagreeable. He sighed. "Then we shall have to stay until someone comes along to take compassion on us, and I hope it won't be too long. I think if I don't get to Elysium soon, I shall decide to stay here and try to find something useful to do." "We can't stay here. It's a horrible place." "You didn't find it so bad before, even in the early days when you were poor." "We are poor now, so we can't afford to stay here. We shall starve, and we have nowhere to sleep. We don't know anyone." "We might see if Narcissus is still living in the villa, or look for you, Epicurus. He will be angry with you for playing such a shabby deceit on him, but he wouldn't refuse to help us. Narcissus won't be angry long. He's too lazy." "I'm not going to crawl back and apologize to them. I'd rather starve." "I doubt it, if you knew what starvation felt like. You've never been properly hungry, Lucina." "I'm hungry now, but I'm not making a fuss about it." I realized this was painfully true. It seemed days since I had anything to eat, and now I began to think about it. About the lack of food was like a cold hand twisting my empty belly. "I've eaten less than you," said Euripides. "If we are determined to starve, I shall go first, and then you really will be alone. You're not feeling ill, are you?" "Oh dear, Euripides, please don't be ill." "You would find it inconvenient to lose me?" To my intense mortification, I began to cry. "I know I'm horrid, but please don't leave me. You promised we should go back to Elysium." He shivered, so I took off my cloak and wrapped it around him. I knew he must be feeling much worse than he admitted, for he let me do it without protest, even though I only had a thin tunic and it had begun to rain. I must get food for him, and wine, hot wine, would be better than anything. After he'd had something to eat, I must look for a warm place to spend the night. "Wait for me, I shan't be long." I dragged 3 of the barrels to try to make a better shelter for him. He leaned back against them and closed his eyes, as though exhausted. The cobbles hurt my feet as I ran along the quay, towards a cluster of dim lights which belonged to a few squalid shops that sold cheap food to sailors. In each shop the shutters had been put up, and they would not open the door to me, even when I banged with my clenched fists. I banged so hard that my knuckles were raw, but still they did not hear me. I came to a wine shop, but the woman who owned it demanded to see my money before she would serve me. I gave her a handful of bronze and silver coins, but instead of becoming obsequious, she looked at them disdainfully and told me they were false. I kept my anger and tried to make her realize she was wrong, but she told me to get out before her husband threw me into the street. I became desperate. Somehow I must help Euripides. It did not matter how. He was too important to be allowed to starve. He could teach people to laugh at themselves, he said. That was the key to real freedom. It was too difficult a lesson for me to learn, but at least I was discovering how to cry at myself, and the tears were not entirely self-pity. I would lie or steal or beg, but I would get food for him. I would not let him discover that loving Lucina always led to disaster. It would be easier to die than to beg, but not easier to let Euripides die. I came to a crowded street and knelt in the gutter, holding out my hand for alms. I kept my head bent so that no one should recognize me, but the people hurried past, ignoring my supplication. I saw a litter coming towards me. In it there was a woman who looked like Julia. For a moment I thought it was Julia's ghost who threw me the small coin, which sank into the mud before I could find it. But this woman was younger than Julia. She may even have been a member of the same family. Julia was not an uncommon type. What would Marius think of his mother if he knew she was begging in the streets of Rome? I should have to kill my pride and ask Narcissus to help me. I must go to the villa that once I had been proud to buy for them. Go there to beg, to ask for their charity. Would Epicurus be there too? It would not be easy to tell him that I had let them sorrow because I had found it more convenient to be dishonest. The hill leading to the villa was steeper than I expected. There were no lights in the windows. Perhaps everyone had gone to bed. If I knocked on the shutters, they would hear and open to me. The shutters swung loose in the wind. The house was deserted. It was not so dark up here above the city. I could see dirty straw, mouldy with age, in the empty stables, and dust was thick on the floor of the deserted rooms. In a corner I found a broken attic vase. It was like the one Epicurus gave me. Was it the one I had broken long ago and been sarcastic because he had been upset? I had told him that I could easily buy another, and he had said that I taught him money could buy nothing worth having. Why had he said that, when he used to teach me that money was the only thing which was safe to love? Perhaps I could mend it if I collected all the pieces. I gathered them up and tied them in the hem of my tunic. Only the garden was unchanged. There were grapes on the vines, unripe but eatable. They might help Euripides if I could find nothing better. I picked several bunches to carry with me and ate a handful. They were so sour that they made my tongue dry, but they helped the hunger pain. I was glad the gardener had been allowed to look after the vines. At least I had not been unkind to him. I went a little further and saw that he had terraced the slope below the balustrade. The grapes were much riper there, so I threw away the green ones and picked others, whose skins were flushed with purple. But grapes would not be enough for Euripides, and I must have money to bribe a shipmaster. Suddenly I thought of Porgius. Culchus, he called himself. If I asked for Culchus, someone would tell me where he lived. I saw you pass and follow you here. Porgius was standing outside the deserted villa, looking down at me from the upper terrace. I ran towards him and he took my hands and kissed me on the cheek. I always hoped you would tell me when you wanted us to meet again, he said. Salonius believed you were dead, and I thought it kinder not to tell him you had run away. It would have broken Salonius' faith if I had allowed him to lose his belief in you. You forgot that you were his only link with our reality. If you had remembered, you could not have run away with Nigellus, and then Nigellus would have had courage too. How do you know about Nigellus? Salonius came to me after he believed you drowned. He hoped I should be able to assure him that you were happy. You had told him that to die suddenly can at times be dangerous. He was distraught to be without you. He believed that had he used a more tactful approach, You would have returned to Rome before you went out on a too rough sea. He thought he had killed you by his lack of understanding. He kept on saying that he ought to have let you take Nigellus for a lover until you learned that your real role was not too difficult. Poor Salonius, he was in anguish. I also had misjudged him, for I thought he was immune to such an intensity of grief. What has happened to him? He works as a physician of the most ordinary kind, chiefly in the poorest quarters. He attends women in labour, washes sores he has no hope of curing, comforts the dying. He does this as a kind of penance for a sin he did not commit, the sin of driving you away. Tears were sliding down my face, but I did not bother to brush them away. So even Salonius had suffered because I had tried to escape. I had not realized that I had hurt so many people when I tried to run away from love. If I had had the courage to keep love in spite of its perils, I could have protected them. I could have had clean pride instead of this slow shame. Is it love you feel, Lucina? Do you really want your pride to be clean? Do you want to cure Salonius? Could I? Could I help him even a little? I owe him so much. Do you love him better than your pride? Would you go to his house in your poverty and ask him to forgive you? If you will look after Euripides, I will go to Salonius. Euripides is waiting for you on the ship which will sail tomorrow. He's well cared for. You need have no anxiety for him. It was he who told me where to find you. But he didn't know I meant to come here. I told him nothing would make me look for Narcissus or Epicurus. Perhaps he knew you better than you knew yourself. He sent a message to me, knowing I would not fail you. Why are you so kind? Why, when you know what I've done? He smiled. You gave me back my faith in myself when it was flickering. Is it surprising that I'm glad to be able to remind you that Lucina has much of which to be proud? How can I be proud? Because there are many people who remember you with love. For each person who aroused in you only a lust for power, there were many whom you really loved. It does not matter, Lucina, if you forget that you loved them. For love, however apparently fleeting, however trivial, is the only indestructible factor which exists. You've done what many would consider miracles. It's not miraculous to give happiness for sorrow, health for pain, truth for blindness. You seldom took just credit for the real things you did, for usually they seemed so easy. If I was kind, how could I be cruel? If I could love, how could I be heartless? The majority of mankind can afford to allow their souls to be grey, a darker or lighter grey according to the state of their essential nature. But you took the way of the priests. It was necessary for you to divide yourself into two arbitrary divisions, the black and the white, and all the other opposites. Is it surprising that at times you have swung between the manifold extremes? It is not easy to remain still in the midst of conflict, to hold the balance, true. You have many lessons still to learn. You must recognize your failures without guilt. You must see your triumphs without fool's pride. You must rejoice that you are chosen to carry out the wishes of your superiors. And now, are you ready to go to Salonius? Yes, I said very humbly, yet I felt happy for the first time for such a long time. Porcius told me that he would have to stay in the room while I was talking to Salonius. I don't think it was because he wanted to be sure I had told everything. It made it easier for us to talk, though I'm not sure how. Salonius was sitting in a chair beside a brazier. I expected him to be startled at seeing me, but instead he said, "So at last I can see you again, Lucina. I have prayed so hard that I should see you before I died, and now you have proved that you always told the truth. Do you remember telling me that it was worth having the courage to go on praying even when the gods seemed deaf? Can I take your hand, or would that spoil things?" Why shouldn't you take my hand? If you don't hate me too much, please try not to hate me, for I have come to ask your forgiveness. I didn't know, he said. I can see you, but... So he thought I was a ghost? Dear Salonius, he ought to have known that if I had been a ghost, I should have had more sense than to wear a torn tunic and sandals so old they were falling to pieces. But I knew I must be gentle with him in case he was startled. Your hands are warm, he said. I expected them to be cold. Should I tell him I was not a ghost? I looked at Porcius, who shook his head, so I knew I must only tell him what had happened to me since our parting. Salonius, I said, I have so much to tell you. Will you pretend that we are discussing someone else, as we so often used to do? Someone who is in guilt and is begging for release. Let me sit at your feet and talk. Talk until there is nothing I have to hide. It will be like the old days, Lucina, sitting together in the firelight and talking. You used to tell me stories which were so much more real than my philosophies. You never knew a physician could have a philosophy, did you? He stroked my hair as I talked and never ceased a gentle protective caress, even when I confessed my worst sins. These sins were little things, being indifferent when Nigellus made love to me and laughing at Narcissus. The big things, like pretending to be dead, did not seem so important. All Salonius said when I finished was, so there was never a real gulf between us. What a fool I was not to recognize your humanity. I put you on a pedestal to worship and drove you away to look for ordinary human warmth. We forgot that we never did anything except by the power of our loving, and we forgot to love enough. Happiness welled up in me like water when you are thirsty, like fire on a bitter night. So you will forgive me? Salonius, can you really forgive all the terrible things I have done to you? I love you, and is there any other forgiveness when the eyes of love are open? Then he kissed me on the forehead and walked quickly out of the room, pausing to look back and smile as he went through the door, as though he were reluctant to go, but had heard someone calling to him, someone he knew needed help. So it was not too difficult, said Porcius. Is it ever too difficult to learn to be happy? I said. The house where Salonius lived must have been close to the quays. I walked with Porcius down a broad street lined with lighted windows, and the people who lived there were happy, for I could hear them singing. The rain had stopped and the river was coloured by the dawn sky. It was a small ship of foreign build. There were 2 sails but no oars, to which he took me. It was half out of the water, though I did not notice this until I was walking up the plank, which joined it to the bank. I looked at the river. Surely they would never be able to launch the ship unless the river rose much higher. Euripides was leaning over the side with a wine cup in his hand. He looked well and was laughing, as though he shared a joke with Porcius. I never knew they were friends. They took me to a cabin forward of the mast. It was small but very comfortably furnished. I was still anxious that we should not be able to sail because of the mud. I did not speak about it, but Euripides showed another flash of his insight. Come on deck to watch the launching, he said. The bank had been deserted, but now it was thronged with people. Soldiers, foreigners, and Romans, slaves, farmers, even women and children. They were hauling on 2 great ropes, tugging us down into the open water. How did they come here? How did such a great crowd know a ship needed help? Why shouldn't they show their gratitude? Said Porcius, as he leapt from the deck to the bank. He cupped his hands to his mouth and shouted, If it hadn't been for you, they would have had to be killed in a futile war. The man who came to the temple disguised as a centurion sent them to help you. It is sometimes useful to have befriended a son of Mars. The next chapter 4 is The Fire.